just a recap to let you know, where's Ukraine? What does it look like? Here's a topographical map. And do you see my arrow here? When I push, the Carpathian Mountains are on the far left side here. And Poland is here, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, Moldova, Belarus, and of course, Russia is on this side over here. There are two bodies of water, the Black Sea and the smaller Azov Sea, okay? And you can see barely the cities, but the capital is here. Kharkiv, the second largest city, is over here. Third largest is Dnipro. Then Odessa down here, and Lviv over on the left side, okay? And this is the heartland where you hear the beautiful black earth and why they call it the black basket of Europe, because the amount of wheat and other agricultural come out of this area over here. Okay, let's look at what happened before February 24th. Before February 24th, Crimea was taken over by Russia, and there are a little bit of two oblasts, or oblast is like a state in the United States. Over here is Luhansk and Donetsk. It was about 1/3 of the territory. So that's what it was on February 24th. Okay, let me go back a little bit just to remind everybody. On August 24th, 1991, Ukraine declares independence. Now, this was before the breakup of the Soviet Union, just to remind you. On December 1, they held a referendum for independence, and 92% of the vote was for independence, including 56% in Crimea. This was the lowest that voted for independence, but still the majority. On December 26, the Soviet Union broke up to a large degree, and this is where Putin is correct, that because of Ukrainian independence, the Soviet Union broke up, because that was the biggest chunk, and they really couldn't do much about that. So in 91, independence, and a lot of people started traveling there, including myself, and things were going okay, except there was hyperinflation and lots of things that were happening. And on November 2004, you had the Orange Revolution. I'm sure most of you remember Orange Revolution that happened in Ukraine, and similar revolution happened in Georgia and a couple other places. Okay, and another fact here, on November 2013, 9 years later, you had the Revolution of Dignity, Maidan. Okay, and on February 27, 2014, Russia sent its little green man to take over Crimea because of the Revolution of Dignity. And this happened because the president at that time, Yanukovych, promised the Ukrainians that they were going to sign an association with Europe. And last minute, Putin put pressure on him, and he reneged on the promise to join the EU. And then the revolution started. In April, Russian-backed separatists take over parts of Luhansk and Donetsk oblasts, including major cities. And this was led by Russian former soldiers or captains, Igor Skirklin and others who led the separatists. And in fact, this was true because they didn't even know where the city administration buildings were. And initially, they went to the wrong building in Donetsk, for example, and they found out that it was the wrong building and they had to find it. So the locals didn't do the revolution. It was inspired totally by Russia. Then war continues. About 10,000 Ukrainians have died during the period between 2014 and 2022. I mean, it was a hot war, but it wasn't really reported on the West. You only had to go local Eastern Europeans to see the war going on. There were several attempts to negotiate the so-called Minsk agreements, but none of them really were able to agree on both sides. Russia basically wanted to have a veto power over the Ukrainian government, and the Ukrainian government said no. I mean, we're a sovereign nation. We can do what we please, and you're not going to have veto power. So anyway, on February 24th of last year, almost 11 months ago, the Russian separatists advanced and invaded Ukraine. Let's see. Hold on a second. Next slide. So political kind of a chronology, just to let you know that Ukraine, when it's formed, it was a constitutional republic. That means it has a president and a prime minister who has a cabinet. And so the prime minister is really the kind of COO of the country, and the president is CEO. I mean, the prime minister is a COO, and the president is like a CEO. It has a parliament, a unicameral parliament. It's called Verkhovna Rada, about 400 people there. And it's elected. Half of the people are elected by local population, by oblasts or states, and the other half are nominated by major parties. It's something similar to, I think Italy has something like that system. It has had 7 presidents since independence, and here they are. Kravchuk has served 1 term, then Kuchma became president. It was quite a strong contest between the two of them, and Kravchuk looked like he was going to win, but the inflation in the country was so high that he couldn't get a second term. Kuchma served 2 terms, and then the next one, Kuchma selected Yanukovych, and so Yanukovych ran for the third presidency, and his opponent was Yushchenko. And if you can remember what happened to Yushchenko, the Russians kind of wanted to make sure that Yanukovych won, and so they poisoned him. Fortunately, Yushchenko went to Switzerland and survived, although his face really got messed up. But the vote was taken. Yanukovych appeared to be winning, but the international community said that this was really not a very good election because there was a lot of forgeries. And so they redid the election, and Yushchenko won by quite a comfortable margin. So he served 1 term. The next president, the Yanukovych, who lost the previous time, got a makeover by none other than our friend Manafort. And you know the name Manafort. He was on the payroll to Russia, and he helped Yanukovych to sort of become clean. You know, he started wearing a tie, a suit, spoke. I mean, Yanukovych was a thug. I mean, he was from the East, and he was a political kind of a hack, but he cleaned his act and he won. Now, in his fourth term, he promised the Ukrainians that they will be able to sign an agreement with EU, and the biggest part of that was free travel between Ukraine and Western Europe without needing a visa. So it just, became very easy for Ukrainians to travel. And when he didn't negate that, a revolution started. Yanukovych kind of pushed to suppress it. 100 people died, including a friend of mine who was a scientist. There were thousands of people protesting, and 100 got killed. So he got thrown out, and then you had Poroshenko, who served one term, and then Zelensky became the next president. And he won mainly because he promised that he was going to end the war and get a peace deal. Remember, by that time, thousands of people Ukrainians were dying in East Ukraine. So he's serving now on Zelensky on his fourth year, and the third year, of course, the war started. Any questions? Okay.
George,
Yes.
you showed in the earlier map, you could go back to the map before the war started. There's a whole little sort of archipelago of the color of the Russian area along the coastline there.
You mean over
those
here?
Yes.
Yeah, that's actually not Ukraine, it's Moldova.
Yeah.
When Moldova became independent, also in 91, there were separatists in the country, Moldova, and they separated and then invited Russia. So 2,000 Russian soldiers are in Moldova, essentially, and they're still there. And that's why I show it like that.
So Zelensky was originally going to settle with the Russians?
Well, he said he was going to negotiate. I mean,
how did that work out?
Well, they met once in Paris, and so Putin and Zelensky met, and it looked like there was some possibility of settlement. The big issue was that Putin insisted that he have veto power over such things as joining EU and NATO. In other words, he had to control the political system, and that was a non-starter with Zelensky. And so after the Paris meeting, things just started to get worse.
So, George, 1991, you say the Ukraine becomes independent. Is this the first time it's been independent for many hundreds of years?
No, they were independent in 1922. 1919, they started when the Russian Revolution happened and all the empires started to crack. The western part of Ukraine, which was under Austria-Hungary, joined eastern part, which was under the Tsar, and they formed a country in constitution, elected a president, and in fact, they were approved by the UN. But what happened was that Stalin, at that time, because Lenin died, when they sort of restructured themselves, they just took over Eastern Ukraine.
Well, it
And
wouldn't have been the UN because the UN doesn't come into existence till
well, the League
45.
of the Nations.
League of Nations, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
League of Nations.
yeah, and then Western Ukraine was occupied by Poland. So they essentially, between Poland and Russia, they divided up Ukraine, even though Ukraine declared self-independent. And it stayed that way until World War II, when Stalin and Hitler made a pact, the Ribbentrop Treaty, essentially agreed that Hitler could invade Poland, including Western Ukraine, and then Eastern Ukraine was under Russia, and they could expand. And so with Stalin and Hitler kind of dividing up everything, it looked like, again, division. But then Hitler decided that he really wanted to get to Ukraine, and so he marched east and took over Western Ukraine, but was stopped by the Russian soldiers, and World War II broke up. But essentially, it was Russia and the Nazis kind of made an agreement, but Hitler decided that he really wanted to take over Ukraine. And if you carefully see what was going on, the breadbasket of Europe is Ukraine. And Hitler really wanted that to feed the Germans.
He also wanted Baku. He wanted the oil.
Oh, yeah, he wanted oil because he needed that, and he needed food.
Yeah.
But that was that. Okay,
Yeah.
So let's go back. Okay, February 24th, the Russian invades and pretext, and this is first Putin said we need to Nazify Ukrainian government. Now, I mean, it was hilarious because here is Zelensky, who is Jewish, and there were no Nazis in the Ukrainian government. There were small pockets of neo-Nazis running around, but they were small number. None of them made it into the government. But anyway, that was the pretext. Then he said, okay, we have to protect Russian speakers from discrimination. Now, Ukraine was divided. Western Ukraine was mostly Ukrainian speakers, although everybody spoke Russian. And then Eastern Ukrainians, they spoke mostly Russian, but they understood and could, converse. When I started going to Ukraine, I don't speak Russian, but when I spoke Ukrainian, I'm fluent in Ukrainian, everybody understood me. And that was in Eastern Ukraine. And so sometimes they replied in Russian to me, and, if I didn't understand it, I kind of asked somebody, well, what does that mean? And sometimes, but there was no problem with the language. There was no discrimination of such. Yes, Ukrainian language was the official language. And when Ukraine became independent, that was one of the things they said, we are Ukraine, and Ukrainian language is going to be official language. But most businesses and everybody still use Russian, you hear on television or hear people, one speaks Ukrainian, the other one replies in Russian, and it's sort of indiscriminate, if you will. There was not a problem. Then he says we wanted to protect the separatist regions from Russia being declared sovereign. Now, he did that because prior to February 24th, those regions were not sovereign. They were just breakaway. But now he declared them as sovereign nations. And three countries agreed: North Korea, Syria, and Russia. China didn't even consider them to be countries. Then he said, prevent Ukraine joining NATO. Prevent Ukraine joining European Union. And after, a few of these things kind of started to sink in, that people kind of started laughing, especially, Nazify Ukrainian. Then he wrote his 5,000-word essay about that Ukraine is artificial. Ukrainians are one people with Russians, and it's basically being propped up by CIA and West trying to break up Russia. And he went back to Peter the Great. And so you'll see that, it was a 350th anniversary of Peter the Great, and Putin wanted to become the new Peter the Great. And then he went on to, he said Lenin and Stalin did the wrong thing by creating the Soviet Union. Ukraine should have been part of Russia. And then he also blamed Khrushchev for giving the Crimea to Ukraine. So, I mean, these are all the reasons that he used for the invasion. What I have now is a couple of videos that I like to show you. The first one was the hidden battle that saved Ukraine. Most people don't remember that, but this was a critical part of the beginning of the war. And then Michael Clark, who's a historian and a Brit, talks about the counter measures, and it's up to January 3rd. And optional videos, this is in case anybody wants to get more, the Kherson campaign, which is very important. Kherson was the first and only regional capital that Russia captured, and Ukraine recaptured it back in August or September. And then finally, people who really would like to know the history of Ukraine chronologically going back 1,000 years or more, Timothy Schneider, who's a history professor at Yale University, did 22 lectures on YouTube. And this is the website that if you can, look at it. And he goes back, as I said, thousands of years of who occupied the area of Ukraine, and the impact of Greeks, Romans, Khazars, Ottoman Empire, and then of course Russia, Poland, and Lithuania. And so through the history, you can just see the ability of Ukrainians trying to form into a unit and being always broken up by either the people in the west, the people in the east or north. So what I would do is next run this, and hopefully, let me know if you have the sound, but I think I turned on the sound.
It is 8 a.m. on February 24th, 2022.
Do you hear the sound?
Yes.
Okay.
Although no one in Ukraine realizes it yet, what is about to unfold in a relatively unassuming part of the country will arguably be the single most important event in Ukrainian history. The stakes could not be higher. The country itself is on the line. If Ukraine fails, Russian soldiers will have established a critical foothold into the country's interior. Soon after, hordes more soldiers and materiel will flood into Ukraine. Kyiv, the capital, will come under immediate attack. It is unlikely that Ukraine's army has the ability, or ammunition, to fend off such an assault. President Zelensky will be captured, or worse. Ukraine will become like a headless corpse. Not much after that, the rest of the country will likely get the Crimea treatment and be formally annexed into the Russian Federation bit by bit. Putin's dreams of being a modern-day Peter the Great will finally be fulfilled, and his legacy will be forever cemented in the upper echelon of Russian leaders. And I have even worse news for Ukraine. Ukraine is going to lose this battle. It is going to hurt, and hurt bad. The scene will look less like a war in the year 2022, and more like something out of a post-apocalyptic movie fit for Hollywood. And yet, somehow, someway, this will all be just fine for Ukraine. This is the story of the Battle of Hostomel Airport. Prologue. Founded in 1494, Hostomel is a small town of 18,000 people on the outskirts of Kyiv. Its main economic driver is the Hostomel Airport, also known as the Antonov Airport due to Antonov Airlines' presence there. Despite its prominence in the local economy, to the average person, it is an unassuming facility built in 1959. There is little reason to be familiar with it. The facility focused on cargo operations. By contrast, Ukraine's largest airport, with 15 million yearly passengers, Boryspil International, sits just on the other side of Kyiv. And speaking of Kyiv, Ukraine's second busiest airport outside of Crimea is Kyiv International, located just 26 kilometers away from Hostomel. Those are the airports that everyone knows and flies into and out of, especially with international travel, not Hostomel. Instead, prior to the war, Hostomel's claim to fame was that it was the home of the world's largest aircraft, Antonov Airlines' AN-225. It's something that they are very proud of. They make models of that specific one-of-a-kind plane. Google Earth thinks that it is so important that they programmed a 3D rendering of it, complete with a retro 1980s paint job. They even got the flag right. Unfortunately, however, its own history is a microcosm for the events that are about to take place. As the tail emblem indicated, the AN-225 is a product of the Soviet era, first flown on December 21, 1988, specifically to transport the Buran spaceplane. The Buran program began in 1980 as the Soviet answer to the American Space Shuttle program. The visual similarities are striking, so much so that it became a political problem in Moscow. Some wanted to change the design so that the Soviet Union could not be accused of copying the Americans. However, raw aerodynamics ultimately won out. Most of the space shuttle's design was already optimized. Politics, in this case, was no match for physics. But to be fair to the Soviet engineers, this was not a copycat job. Thanks mostly to a different fuel system, the Buran had a slightly larger payload capacity and could return significantly more from orbit. Of course, such a system is incredibly large and heavy. To transport it around the Soviet Union, you would also need an enormous plane, hence the AN-225. But the plane's glory days were behind it, as it quietly sat at the Hostomel airport within this hangar. Rather than hauling around the pride of the Soviet space program, its most recent mission was to ferry 90 tons of COVID tests from China to Denmark. A noble task, to be sure, but not quite what its manufacturers originally had in mind. Through no fault of the AN-225, the Buran system was a complete bust. And yes, despite its promising start, the Space Shuttle program came to be recognized as a failure as well, whether due to the Challenger disaster, or Discovery disaster, or the program's general inability to turn space travel into a routine affair. But the Buran disappeared almost as soon as it debuted. Its only flight occurred on November 15, 1988, an unmanned 3.5-hour trip. From a technical standpoint, the launch was a triumph. But then the Soviet Union collapsed. Russia did not have enough money to continue the program, and so Boris Yeltsin canceled it in 1993. The little money left over for the program was rerouted to the Mir space station. The Buran was an economic failure. And I suppose that is how we got here today. Soviet failures and the inability of Kremlin leadership to establish a glorious legacy. By November 2021, though, it appeared that Moscow might be trying something again. The Buran, the AN-225, and Hostomel Airport were far from anyone's minds. Instead, the focus was on the border between Ukraine and Russia. Act 1. Mobilization. On November 13, 2021, Zelensky announced that an estimated 100,000 Russian soldiers had amassed along the border between Ukraine and Russia. The next 3 months were a jumbled mess of maneuvering, duplicity, and conflicting messaging. Russia at various points denied that any mobilization was happening, and that any troop movements were a part of an elaborate war game operation. The United States was concerned, however. President Biden dispatched CIA Director William Burns to Moscow at the beginning of the month to meet with his Russian counterparts. On December 7th, Biden and Putin further discussed the issues via a video conference call. One imagines that the pleasantries that began the meeting did not last long. The Kremlin later described the tone of the conversation as frank and businesslike. By January 2022, the Biden administration had become convinced that Russia was going to invade, predicting a launch window between the middle of February and the end of March. The U.S. diplomatic focus turned toward raising awareness of the possibility of an invasion. The goal was to signal that the West would not tolerate such an action from Russia. With any luck, the campaign would convince Moscow that the economic devastation that Western allied countries could unleash would outweigh any benefit that Moscow could plausibly gain in Ukraine. Interestingly, Zelensky took a different approach, aiming to downplay the possibility that an invasion was inevitable. It's not that Ukraine was oblivious to the risks in front of it. The country had been in a de facto war against Russia over the Donbas region since 2014. Zelensky's predecessor, Petro Poroshenko, had previously met with Putin through a peace talk process sponsored by France and Germany. Briefly, Zelensky too had taken part in these negotiations. He knew about the security threat. And if Zelensky was too optimistic, the United States sent CIA Director Burns to Ukraine to go over U.S. intelligence about a possible war. Instead, the reason Ukraine wanted to downplay the threat was all about economics. Zelensky worried that the endless talk of war would drive all the economic investment out of Ukraine. And if a war were to start afterward, Ukraine did not want to have to fight from a position as if it had been under de facto economic sanctions for months prior. Moreover, there was some chance that this would ultimately go nowhere. After all, Russia had undergone an earlier mobilization in March and April 2021. But this did not culminate with an actual invasion, and the Russian troops partially withdrew by June. Perhaps this was a repeat of that. Maybe Russia would rattle its saber but not pursue things any further, especially now that the West was uniting in opposition. Because this was a plausible interpretation of what was happening, Ukraine had not gone into full defense mode. Its alert status was elevated, but full mobilization was not yet in the picture, and Zelensky still wore suits. Ukraine's posture over at Hostomel Airport reflected this. Only 300 troops were stationed there at the time. And bear in mind that this is Ukraine. These weren't 300 Spartans. They were National Guard troops, essentially armed caretakers. Ukraine's true heavy hitters, and its heavy equipment, were over in the Donbas, taking part in that Russian-sponsored separatist war dating back to 2014. Obviously, the Hostomel contingent seemed relatively understaffed, but remember, Ukraine thought that the odds that Russia would attack were acceptably low. Even the 300 troops stationed at Hostomel were laughing at the United States' frequent warnings about this. Yes, the military balance appeared stacked in Russia's favor, but the costs of diplomatic retaliation would simply be too high for the Kremlin to bear. There was no way Russia would be that silly, right? Act 2. Russia would be that silly. We don't know why Russia went down this route. We might not know for sure for a long time either. Political scientists and historians will be debating this for decades to come. But we have explored a few possibilities here before. Perhaps Putin's intelligence organizations were too scared to feed him accurate information about how weak the Russian military was. Perhaps they genuinely believed that Ukrainians would not defend their, at the time, unpopular president. A 31% approval rating prior to the invasion might do that. Perhaps Moscow thought that a Russian invasion would resemble the Iraq War, where many Iraqi soldiers simply abandoned Saddam Hussein rather than fight the United States. Perhaps Putin calculated that the West's response would be tepid. After all, when Putin signed the papers to annex Crimea 8 years earlier, the pressure Western states produced was manageable. And speaking of Crimea, perhaps the political situation there was deteriorating. If so, as we have discussed before, Russia would have needed to do something to create a land bridge to the peninsula, and thereby solve the logistical headaches that they were encountering. Absent that, they might lose it. Maybe the Kerch Strait Bridge was not sufficient to do the job on its own. In other words, this was all a convoluted plot to keep control of the strategically critical Sevastopol naval base. But however Ukraine and Russia arrived at this point, they were now there. The era of joint parades was over. Now was the time to fight. At 4:30 a.m. Ukrainian time, Putin got on Russian national television to declare that a special military operation had begun. One way to win a war, or even a special military operation, is to decapitate the opposing leadership. That was easier said than done here. Russia was using Belarus as a staging ground. Even so, it is a 154-kilometer drive from the southern tip of Belarus to Kyiv. Moscow's solution instead was to establish a forward operating base close to the capital. While Kyiv International Airport might seem like a good starting point, it is in the middle of a large population center and would be naturally better defended. Then there is the fact that Kyiv International Airport's runway is only 2,300 meters long. Military aircraft tend to be heavier and also carry heavy things, like those tanks Russia desperately needs to invade Kyiv. That means that the military planes require longer runways. You know where Russia could find one of those? That's right, Hostomel Airport. Cargo planes also like the length, and we have a full 3,500 meters of that goodness over here. No wonder the AN-225 called Hostomel home. Conveniently enough for Russia, Hostomel Airport was also just beyond the outer edge of the defense perimeter that Ukraine would later establish for Kyiv. Why Russia seemed less interested in Boryspil is not as obvious. It too sits outside of Kyiv's main population center, and has an even longer runway at 4,000 meters. However, Russia chose to bomb it rather than control it at the beginning of the war. A likely explanation is that Russia had planned for the first phase of the Kyiv assault to come from the western side of the Dnipro River, making Hostomel the logistically simpler choice. An attack east of the river would come shortly afterward, but it's a greater distance to Boryspil anyway. Regardless, it was a simple plan for Russia. Use a combined assault to capture Hostomel Airport, land everything the army needs to stage an attack on Kyiv, capture the capital, watch the rest of Ukraine fall apart, and maybe have the troops all back home by Easter. It's easy, really. Act 3. The first shots. Early on, it would seem that easy. 3.5 hours after Putin's announcement, or 8 a.m. in Hostomel, a group of Mi-8 transport helicopters with hundreds of Russian troops aboard approached the airport. Ka-52 attack helicopters provided support, aiming to soften the target to allow for a safe deployment of the ground forces. Here we see the point of view of one of the attack helicopters approaching the airport. Far in the background on the left, we see the hangar that holds our old friend, the AN-225. Ukraine tried to fight back, but this was a new experience. The separatists in the Donbass have no air force. It was all about trench warfare, World War I style. Thus, Ukrainian troops were not accustomed to fighting an opponent in the skies. To make matters worse, Russia apparently knew where Ukraine's airport defense systems were located and struck them ahead of time. Afterward, Ukraine would blame a treasonous airport employee for relaying that information to Moscow, though Ukraine had fortuitously moved around some of the systems, thereby preventing Russia from hitting all of them. And Ukraine showed some ability to fight back by downing at least one of the Ka-25s. Overall, though, Russia's movements were slowed, not stopped. 3 hours into the battle, the Mi-8 helicopters deployed their paratroopers and began the ground assault. Ukraine's 300 National Guard soldiers were no match for a combined air and ground operation. Running out of ammunition, Ukraine chose to retreat. Russia took control of the airport, surveying the scene on the ground and eyeing the AN-225's hangar. Interlude. If this were the end of the story, it would also be the end of modern Ukraine. We may never know exactly what Russia planned to fly in, but the common belief is that 18 Ilyushin Il-76 planes were headed from Russia and preparing to land at Hostomel. Since its first flight in 1971, the Il-76 became a workhorse for the Soviet military. Undoubtedly, the fleet of 18 of them held countless Russian soldiers and weapons. Once landed in Hostomel, they would set their sights on Kyiv, with a very high chance of success. What Russia intended to do once there remains ambiguous. Simply enjoy some old-fashioned Ukrainian hospitality? Probably not. Hold the city hostage until Ukraine released its eastern regions to Russia? That seems more likely. Do that and replace Zelensky with a puppet government? Possibly. Or fulfill that Peter the Great fantasy and outright annex the entire country? That'd be hard to do without facing a massive insurgency, but maybe. Whatever the answer, the loss of the airport would mean that Ukraine as we know it would have ceased to exist. Unless Ukraine had a secret. Act 4. Ukraine's backup plan. The Battle of Hostomel Airport is hidden in the sense that it is not a common part of the public discourse. If you listen to the news, you will hear about Kherson, the northern front just to the east of Kharkiv, the Crimean Bridge, the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, the bizarre excursion through Chernobyl, and the follow-on battle for Kyiv itself. Hostomel, however, stays out of the limelight. But if you look hard enough, you can find it. There's a Wikipedia page just on the battle. The Washington Post has a wonderful article on it from their series on Putin's miscalculation. Or consult the Los Angeles Times, or New York Times, or Wall Street Journal. You get the idea. However, when it comes to this battle, a different entity can one-up mankind's biggest repository of knowledge, Jeff Bezos' newspaper plaything, and the rest. Whom am I referring to? Why, it's none other than the US government. Let's flash back to January 2022. Remember, US intelligence was convinced that Russia was going to invade. And remember how CIA Director Burns went to Kyiv to inform Zelensky about the gravity of the situation? Well, he also came with something else. Russia's battle plans. We don't know how the CIA acquired this information, but suffice it to say that the US's $50 billion per year black budget for intelligence buys a lot of information. And all signs pointed toward the same place, Hostomel Airport. Thus, though Ukraine only had 300 National Guard soldiers actively defending the facility, there was a backup plan. That was bad news for the Russian troops at Hostomel. They were in a precarious position. The mission began with helicopters inserting them deep behind enemy lines. And because the soldiers were dropped in, they were without the armored vehicles that they would want to use to protect themselves over the long term. Rather than soften up the Ukrainian targets with days of aerial bombings and cruise missile strikes, like the US has done before its recent invasions, Russia committed to the ground invasion from day one. The whole operation was predicated on Ukraine quickly folding. But that was the Russian philosophy more generally heading into the war. Moscow thought that Ukraine's government was unpopular, that many Ukrainians would actively side with Russia, and that others would not care enough to resist. That assessment was wrong. Act 5. The Counterattack. With the clock ticking due to the IL-76s, Ukrainian Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, Valery Zaluzhny, sent in the cavalry. This included Ukrainian Special Forces, a mechanized brigade, a rapid reaction brigade, and the Georgian Legion, founded in 2014 by Georgians looking to settle the score with Russia after the 2008 Summer War. Additional support came from Ukrainian artillery, which now pointed at the airport. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian Air Force scrambled to counteract Russian aircraft that might harass Ukraine's ground forces. The push began with paratroopers approaching the airport from the west. The airport's walls prevented them from gaining quick entry, and those that made it over were immediately pinned down by Russian gunfire. It briefly looked like the counterattack would fail, but shortly thereafter, 2 more units arrived, one coming from the north and the other coming from the southeast. Under these conditions, the IL-76s could not land, guaranteeing that the force ratio would remain favorable to Ukraine in the short run. Overwhelmed and lacking cover, Russian troops had no choice but to retreat to the woods around the airport. According to a Russian logbook recovered by the New York Times, up to 300 of the Russian paratroopers died in the battle, and by the time February 24th had ended, Ukraine was back in control of the airport. But I told you up front that Ukraine was going to lose this one, so that is not the end of the story. The next day, a Russian column coming from Belarus and going through Chernobyl reached Hostomel. This was the prelude of what the world would eventually come to know as the infamous Kyiv convoy. And although the convoy would eventually become a punchline, this was still only 24 hours into the war. All of the convoy's logistical failures were not yet present. As a result, the force ratio swung back into Russia's favor. This time, Ukraine lacked an effective reply. With no better alternative, the Ukrainian troops retreated. Hostomel Airport fell back into the hands of Russia, and this time it was for the remainder of the first phase of the war. However, airport might not be the right word. The direct engagements, Ukrainian airstrikes, Ukrainian artillery, and whatever sabotage operations Ukrainian soldiers may have engaged in overnight had rendered the runway unusable. Russia won the fight, but failed to accomplish its main objective, to secure an immediate air bridge to Kyiv. Russian soldiers would begin clearing debris and repairing the runway once the installation was secured. But by the time that was completed, the main danger to Ukraine had passed. Ukraine may have lost the battle, but in doing so, it left open a chance for it to win the war. Epilogue. The next day, Russia would try capturing another airstrip, albeit a shorter one, further south in Vasilkiv. That operation failed, and Russia would later destroy the airstrip instead. Following Russia's capture of Hostomel Airport, fighting spilled over to the remainder of the city and to the surrounding towns. By February 28th, the proper Russian convoy reached Hostomel, but Ukrainian forces kept up the pressure. The convoy did not get much further, and certainly never reached its intended target of Kyiv. A month later, on March 29th, Russia announced a withdrawal from the Western Front, ending the existential threat to the Ukrainian state. In the aftermath, evidence of war crimes surfaced in the neighboring town of Bucha. A June 2022 report from the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees documented the unlawful killings of at least 50 civilians, and further noted the destruction of at least 482 residential buildings. President Zelensky would later visit the town to survey the damage firsthand. Meanwhile, the airport was a wreck, the result of the original battle and the constant artillery fire afterward. It is unclear when it will reopen for civilian use, or if it will reopen at all. And our old friend, the AN-225, completely broken, just like the Soviet legacy it originated from. 6 of the world's largest jet engines and 290 feet of wingspan now just sit there in tatters, the plane's yellow and blue stripes standing out against the otherwise post-apocalyptic landscape. Both its home and the neighboring hangar containing another Antonov Airlines plane were shredded. In May, Zelensky announced intentions to build a replacement. Antonov Airlines made a similar announcement in November. But with an estimated price tag of $500 million and no need for it to haul a Buran-class orbiter, it remains unclear whether investors will actually foot that bill. Instead, it may just live on in our memories as perhaps the single most expensive casualty of the war. If you want to know more about the invasion, you will love my book that explains the causes of it. Check below for more information on that. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see.
Okay, given the time, it's 11:30. There is no time to see the second video. The second video sort of gives you the up-to-date situation. Obviously, you've seen Kyiv was saved. The other major counteroffensive was in Kharkiv, the second largest city in Ukraine, which is on the east side. Again, it was very successful by the Ukrainian army. The third successful counter-offensive was in Kherson. Kherson was the first regional capital, the only capital that Russia occupied, and it was retaken by the Ukrainian army. Now, the question is, what is next? Okay, what's next? There is talk about another attempt by Russia. They like anniversaries, and so the Ukrainians are preparing for another onslaught in February, or end of January, February, to attack Kyiv and try to do what they did not succeed a year ago. If this fails, I think there will be major repercussions in Russia, because this is first time, Putin was kind of given the pass, but I'm not sure that if he tries again and fails, whether he will survive. But that's, to be decided. The Ukrainians are trying to do a counterattack when the ground is frozen. Now, they've had some mild weather, but here's the counterattack. This is down south. On the right side, this is Crimea, and you see the road from Crimea that goes to eastern Ukraine, which they occupy. And so the idea is, if Ukraine can take over Melitopol, it will break the connection and stop Russians from supplying Crimea. And the only route they will have is the bridge, which has been partially damaged. It's a big risk, but one of the reasons why Melitopol is attractive is you see the water here. So they only have to go about 100 miles from the north, which the Ukrainians already occupy, or to get to Melitopol. And so the idea is that some pundits say that this is the southern counteroffensive and might happen in the next few weeks. It depends upon the ground being frozen. These are marshes over here, and you really can't drive tanks through marshes. Whether that's going to happen, we don't know. But I just give you, it's a repeat of what happened in Kherson. And if the Ukrainians convince the Russians that this is going to happen, they will probably ship some of the soldiers from the eastern Ukraine. And who knows, Ukraine might try to do the same thing they did back in Kharkiv. So it's a ongoing situation. Now, if they liberate Melitopol, the land route to Crimea will be cut. I think the Ukrainian army will continue to push to liberate more of Donbass. They've done a lot of, they liberated about a third of the land that they lost. But what's important is the Western support is critical, especially with heavy armor and weapons. The amount of ammunition that is used in this war is just phenomenal. And Russians are actually getting down to the bottom, and they have decreased the number of ammunition that they use. But the Ukrainians, of course, need the ammunition to keep their pressure on. So anyway, this is where we are today, almost a year into the war. And I don't know, being optimism, I think something will happen and the war will end come spring, summer. If not, it will just continue. And who knows what's going to happen then. Any questions?
We saw recently, what was it, former Secretary of State saying that in the long run, the Ukraine cannot win. Is that
Well,
a fair statement?
no, I don't think so. I think in the long run, I mean, 20 years or hence or 10 years.
Well, I think of the north of the United States destroying the South. And it took them 5 years before they actually got their act, well, 4 years before they actually got their act together. And the South looked really good and strong and beat up the North for quite a while. And then the superior industrial base, just wore them down.
Well, the question is, Russia has a problem of building new missiles, and they're trying to see if they can buy them. They're buying drones from Iran. North Korea is providing them. But obviously, their natural ability to build things within Russia has been dwindling. If Ukraine continues to get Western arms, things are not going to get any better for Russia. They have, I'm not sure about their leadership, but the guy who's leading now was sacked a few months ago, and the guy who was promoted 3 months ago is now being put into a subordinate position. So they're juggling the leadership. 13 generals got killed. And if there is a mobilization in Russia, Putin's going to have to explain why this special operation was going to take 3 or 4 days suddenly now is in a year and requires a full mobilization. So I don't think that's going to go over well with a lot of Russians. More Russians have left Russia during the partial mobilization than actually were mobilized. He wanted to have 300,000 new recruits. Well, an equal number of young people, men, left Russia to Kazakhstan, Georgia, any place they could within, days of the announcement. So I think, they're going to have a problem with people. The other thing that which we don't hear much about, many of the Muslim oblasts in Russia are seeing that Moscow is being weakened. And I think Chechnya, Dagestan, Tatarstan, and so forth are not happy to see their young men getting butchered in Ukraine. And they're thinking, well, maybe we should be independent. So, the chances of, like the Soviet Union fell apart, the chances of the Russian Federation is not, minimal. And as you probably read, Kazakhstan basically supports Ukraine. And they have quite a few Ukrainians in Kazakhstan as well as Russians. So I'm not sure that things are going to go well, but yes, it is possible. But this wouldn't be the first time that Ukraine faced the odds and it survived. So
It was a good presentation, George, and I particularly appreciate the maps. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you, George. I have a
Okay.
question
yes,
about personnel. When I see news clips of Ukrainian soldiers, very large number of them, fraction of them, I should say, a very large fraction of them seem to be middle-aged. I'm wondering whether the Ukrainian army really has the personnel to sustain a longer war.
well, it's a good question, but I would say that unlike Russia, most of the officer corps of Ukrainians are younger than Russians. Just look at the Minister of War or in Russia, which is Sigyu, which is kind of the same age as Putin, whereas Ukrainian, the guy looks like his early 40s. So the other major difference is Ukraine soldiers, to a large extent, are better educated. And so many, IT tech people are in the army, and they're much more able to innovate things, whereas the Russian army, some of them come from the Far East, and it was hilarious because there was a meeting between Russian soldiers and some of the babushka, old ladies in Chernihiv, and she spoke to them in Russian, and they had a hard time, replying in Russian. And she said, "Well, who are you?" And they said, "Well, Russian." She said, "No, you can't be Russian. You don't look like Russian." And so it was a shock for many of the Russians who invaded Ukraine to find the locals who were Russian speakers didn't want to have anything to do with Russia. Remember, the Ukrainians for 30 years have been free of Russia, and for the last 10 years have been able to travel throughout Europe freely. And so the education level of the soldiers in Ukraine is far higher than it is of Russians.
Can you tell me, I'm Mike's wife, Judy, can you tell me what impact this crash of the helicopter yesterday in the Ukraine, which took down the Interior Ministry, will have on the country, on the war? And is there any knowledge about whether this was a Russian-based attack on that helicopter?
Or sabotage?
Yeah, we don't know. I mean, it's just you have to have an investigation, but it looks like an accident. And helicopters are, I would have trouble riding a helicopter without making sure that my insurance is paid. So, but I don't know. We have to wait and see what happens. It was a tragic thing. but I don't think that the interior minister was as important as, for example, the defense minister, some of the other people, or the general in charge, Lusutski, who's in charge of overall the military. Any other questions?
George, I have one quick question. Do you have any idea of numbers of Ukrainians that can fight? Because the one thing that Russia has is a superior number of people that they could throw into it. However, military tactics changing as it is, Ukraine can actually, can beat a 3-to-1 majority Russian to Ukrainian. But Ukrainians still have to have a number of people that they can put into battle because they're losing people quite a bit. And my sense is that the Ukrainian people will never let the Russians take over their country. In other words, they'll act as civilians to kick them out. So I'm just wondering in terms of sheer numbers, whether Ukraine can hold out.
I think so. The answer is yes, because remember, the Russians are invading Ukraine and the Ukrainians are kind of fighting for their land and freedom. And the numbers are not completely, the Russians, until day one, really didn't know that they were going into Ukraine. And they still don't know exactly what the objective is. I mean, is it to take over Ukraine? Denazify. I mean, they were looking for Nazis, for example, in Kherson, and people didn't know what they were talking about. They said, well, where are the Nazis? And, there were no Nazis. So I think that the number, yes, Russia has 3-to-1, 140 million, and Ukraine has 40 million. But the number of soldiers mobilized in Ukraine is higher than what it is in Russia. And remember, Ukrainians have been fighting a war for 8 years. So in some sense, they have some hardened, experienced soldiers, more so than Russia.
They also were trained by Russians too. So the Ukrainians really know Russian warfare tactics. And with the West helping Ukraine now, they're going to change tactics against Russia. So that's going to put a lot of advantage, I think, to the Ukrainian side.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think the Ukrainian lower level can make decisions. The structure in Russia is, any decision you have to make, it goes through several layers. And by the time you get a decision, it's overtaken by events. Whereas Ukrainians are much more mobile.
We better not re-elect Trump.
I agree.
With regard to Dick's question and comment, the Ukrainians probably know the Russian tactics. One of the things that's lesser known is the extent to which over the years, like going back even 5 years, American troops started training the Ukrainians on tactics and weapons use and things of that sort. And so the Ukrainians in that sense are not fighting the Russians using Russian tactics. They're using much more modern tactics.
I mean, I have to say that unknown to me at least, the Pentagon after 2014 has been training Ukrainian soldiers. And it's sort of, we did not know that, but through the Obama and even Trump period, the Ukrainians were being trained in large number. So when the war broke out, it wasn't like they started from scratch.
Yeah, it would appear that Ukraine, however, will have to learn how to use some of the more advanced weapons systems they're getting now.
And as we speak, they're learning. I read that in Texas, there are like 300 Ukrainians learning how to, operate the Abrams tank. And a similar number in Germany are training. And,
Yeah, I have read that we're sending them more advanced tanks.
yeah.
I thought they were being trained to use Patriot missiles.
They
well,
already know how to use those.
Yeah.
I think the
Ger-
Patriot training is in Germany.
Yeah.
That was just in the news within the last week.
Yeah.
The other thing is that I knew that Raytheon received a contract to provide additional arms for the Ukraine, and I was concerned that it would take a year and a half to manufacture them and send them. But I subsequently learned that there were stockpiles of those arms in some other countries. And part of the arrangement, I believe, is for Ukraine to get some of the stuff from other countries, and then the Raytheon manufacturing will resupply the places from which they're coming.
Yeah, in fact, I just read this morning that there was a stockpile of something in Israel, and the U.S. is taking them out of the stockpile in Israel and sending it to Ukraine.
Yeah, I had heard Middle East, and it was not Israel, it was one of the other countries. But I know that there are some issues between Israel and Russia, where Israel doesn't want to screw up their relationships with Russia right now. So they're being kind of cautious in what they're doing.
Israel does need Russian cooperation in Syria.
So, but this is a stockpile that's American owned, and so they have freedom to move them. So
And
Israel,
also, there was
Yeah,
a story yesterday about British tanks being sent over.
yeah,
And I think it's more general across NATO now, that, some of the German tanks are beginning to be freed up, not from Germany, but from some of the countries that in NATO that already have German tanks. It's going to be interesting because how the Ukrainians manage all this. They'll have so many different weapon systems, all of which
Yeah.
are in the same category. It's going to be quite a variety that they're going to have to manage.
I have a feeling Ukraine, this is not the first time Ukraine has had to cobble stuff together from various sources.
including Russia. I mean, I think something like 200 tanks were abandoned by Russians in East Ukraine, and the soldiers basically said they jumped into the tank and just changed the flag, and it became a Ukrainian tank. So,
Well, due to the experience during the Soviet era, they would
Yeah.
know how to operate some of those.
yeah. So anyway, it's a difficult situation, and I just hope that I pray that Putin will come to his senses somehow. I don't know what his escape plan is, but I hope it's something that's lets the world, calm down, because this is the largest war in European space since World War II. So, okay, guys.
Thanks, George.
All right. Thank you.